Thousands of voices fell silent when Ibrahim Traoré stood before the crowd in Nairobi. No music, no banners, only his presence filled the air like a storm waiting to break. In that very first moment, people sensed that something unusual was about to happen, something that could change the rhythm of an entire generation. Before I take you further into the shocking story, make sure you subscribe to this channel so you do not miss the next chapter that may shake your own thoughts about leadership and courage. The hall was overflowing with young faces, restless eyes searching for a voice that understood their struggles. Traoré did not begin with greetings or long introductions. His first words were sharp, almost like a blade cutting through silence. He spoke of dignity, of stolen dreams, and of the chains that had silently been placed on Africa's youth. The words were not shouted, yet they carried the weight of thunder. Students who had entered casually were now leaning forward, hanging on each syllable. Then came the twist that no one expected. He turned directly toward the section where government officials were seated, and his voice grew firmer. He reminded them of promises made and broken, of roads left unfinished, and of children left hungry. The crowd gasped as his sentences grew bolder. It was not a politician delivering a speech. It was a soldier speaking truth with the fire of history behind him. Even those who had not known his name before were suddenly whispering to each other, pointing, nodding, as if they had just found the voice they had been waiting for. But what shook the room even more was when he mentioned Kenya itself. Traoré declared that Africa's borders could no longer be lines that divide pain. He spoke about how the struggle of Burkina youth was the same as that of Kenyan youth. Hunger did not change its taste when it crossed into another country, and oppression did not wear a different mask in Nairobi than in Ouagadougou. These words did not just echo, they cracked open hidden frustrations within the young listeners. Suddenly, the hall erupted with chants, not planned, not rehearsed, but born out of the raw truth that had been dropped like fire into dry grass. Among the youth, tears mixed with shouts. Some raised their fists, some cried openly, and some simply stood frozen, unable to believe that a foreign leader could understand their pain better than their own. And while the young roared with hope, President Ruto, sitting with his ministers, tightened his jaw. His face betrayed no smile, no nod of approval. He whispered something to his aide, and that aide left the hall quickly. What had begun as a speech was now turning into a challenge, and everyone could feel the tension rising. The clash was not yet spoken, but it was already alive in the air. A foreign leader had shaken the hearts of Kenya's youth, and the country's own president had just signaled that he had heard enough. The moment President Ruto's aide disappeared through the side door, whispers spread across the hall. Some students noticed it, others ignored it, but a strange unease began to settle in the air. Traoré, however, did not pause. He spoke as if nothing could interrupt his rhythm, as if every second was a battlefield where silence was the enemy. His voice did not rise with anger, yet every word felt like a stone thrown against glass. He spoke of young graduates wandering the streets without work, of mothers selling fruit under the burning sun, while men in suits traded away resources for contracts signed in foreign languages. The crowd leaned closer, some biting their lips, others clenching their fists. His words painted pictures more powerful than any slideshow or statistic could. For the first time, many of these young Kenyans felt that someone was not just addressing them, but speaking for them. Then Traoré shifted his focus. He reminded the whole that Kenya was not alone in its struggles. He spoke of Burkina Faso, where villages had been burned by terrorists, and yet women stood with courage to defend them. He described the soil soaked in sacrifice, and the children who still found the strength to sing songs of hope. In his voice was no pity, only resilience, and the audience felt the weight of solidarity. Every story connected their hearts to a wider struggle. Every example drew them deeper into his world. But what truly sent chills through the crowd was his sudden pause. Traoré placed both hands on the podium, leaned forward, and in a low, steady voice asked a question that seemed to freeze time itself. How long will you wait for your leaders to answer you when your future is being stolen in daylight? The silence that followed was unbearable. It was a kind of silence that did not come from lack of response, but from the inability to deny the truth. Young men and women stared at each other, some shaking their heads, others nodding with tears forming. The reaction was electric. Students rose from their seats, shouting in agreement, clapping until their palms stung. The energy became uncontrollable, and even the security guards at the side struggled to keep the crowd calm. This was no longer a speech. It was a spark, and sparks are dangerous when the ground is dry. And yet, across the stage, President Ruto's face grew darker. He whispered again to another minister seated near him, and this time, the reaction was visible. Security men with earpieces began to gather closer to the podium. Their steps were slow but deliberate, and for those in the first rows, the sight was clear. Something was shifting. The room was no longer only filled with excitement. It was now mixed with tension, the kind of tension that precedes a storm. Traoré noticed them, but he did not flinch. Instead, he raised his voice for the first time, not to defend himself, but to declare, "We are not here to ask permission for freedom. We are here to claim it." And with those words, the whole trembled, because everyone knew this was no ordinary visit. It was the beginning of a confrontation that could no longer be avoided. The whole had become a battlefield of emotions. Cheers clashed with murmurs of fear, and the walls seemed to carry the vibrations of every voice within. Traoré's last words, declaring that freedom would not be begged for, lingered like thunder that refuses to fade. The students, once listeners, were now participants. They stamped their feet on the ground, a rhythm of defiance that spread like a drumbeat of resistance. President Ruto's ministers exchanged restless glances. They knew what this meant. A foreign leader was not only inspiring the youth, he was challenging the government's authority in its own capital. For years, speeches had come and gone, full of polite phrases and hollow promises. But this moment was different. Traoré had broken the unspoken rule: do not disturb the balance between hope and control. At the back of the hall, some student began chanting his name. Traoré, Traoré. The sound grew louder, carrying to the front rows, until it filled every corner of the room. For a brief instant, the leader from Burkina Faso stood still, letting the chants wash over him. His eyes scanned the hall, not with pride, but with a solemn heaviness, as if he knew the weight of the fire he had just lit. Suddenly, a stern voice boomed from the side of the stage. It was one of Ruto's senior officials, stepping forward, raising a hand for silence. "Kenya respects its guests," he said firmly, "but we will not allow our institutions to be turned into arenas of defiance. This must end." The official's words struck like cold water thrown on flames, but the crowd did not quiet. Instead, their chants grew louder, almost desperate, as if they were fighting to hold on to the spark before it was extinguished. Traoré leaned once more toward the microphone. His reply was calm, but sharp enough to slice through the tension. "If truth is defiance," he said, "then silence is betrayal. And I did not come here to betray the youth of Africa." The crowd erupted again, louder than before, and this time even the walls seemed to tremble. The security men were no longer waiting. They moved closer to the podium, their presence impossible to ignore. A few students noticed and began shouting warnings, pointing at the advancing guards. The atmosphere shifted from excitement to confrontation. It was no longer just about words. It was about what those words would cost. President Ruto finally rose from his seat. His movement was slow, deliberate, and it commanded silence more effectively than any microphone. The chants faded, replaced by uneasy whispers. All eyes turned to him as he stepped forward, his face expressionless but his presence heavy. He did not shout. He did not smile. He simply raised a hand and said, "That is enough." The whole froze. The tension was unbearable. In that silence, the clash between two worlds was clear. On one side, a leader who spoke of freedom without fear. On the other, a president defending authority and control. Everyone in the hall knew something irreversible had just begun. The silence after President Ruto's words was heavier than any noise that had come before. His voice had not risen, yet the weight behind it was enough to still the chants and freeze the restless movement of the crowd. Every student, every journalist, every guest sat on edge, waiting for what would follow. It felt less like a gathering and more like the edge of a blade, sharp and dangerous, where even the smallest slip could draw blood. Traoré remained at the podium, his hands resting calmly on either side. He did not step back. He did not lower his gaze. His eyes met those of the Kenyan president, and for a long moment, the whole was trapped in that silent exchange between two men who carried the hopes and fears of thousands. One represented defiance, the other demanded order. The tension broke when a voice from the crowd shouted, "Let him speak." Another followed, and then another, until a wave of young voices rose again. The students were no longer afraid of the presence of guards or the cold authority of the president. Their frustration, buried for years, was rising like water that had finally broken a dam. They wanted more, they needed more, and no command could silence them now. Ruto's ministers looked uneasy, some leaning towards him, whispering urgent advice. The president raised his hand once more, not in anger but in restraint, signaling the guards to wait. He was measuring the situation, calculating the cost of silencing this voice against the risk of letting it grow louder. His decision in that moment would mark not only the rest of the night, but also his relationship with his own youth. Traoré took advantage of the pause. His voice returned, low and steady, carrying across the room with a force that felt unshakable. I did not come here to insult Kenya. I came here to remind Africa that our children deserve more than broken promises and borrowed futures. If these young people are standing today, it is because they see themselves not as Kenyans or Burkina, but as Africans demanding dignity together. The hall trembled once again with applause and chants, but this time it was different. It was not only defiance, it was unity. The students were not merely reacting to his words. They were claiming them as their own. They were no longer spectators. They had become part of the story. At that moment, something unexpected happened. A young girl, no more than 16, rose from the middle rows. Her school uniform was simple, her face determined. She stepped forward, her voice carrying across the hall. "If our leaders are afraid of these words," she cried, "then perhaps they are afraid of us." The entire hall erupted with thunderous cheers. Traoré's eyes softened for the first time that evening, and even he seemed moved by her courage. President Ruto's expression hardened. The spark that had begun with a speech was now spreading beyond control. And as he stood there, staring at the sea of youth rising against silence, one thing was certain. The battle for their loyalty had just begun, and it would not end with words alone. The whole had become unrecognizable. What began as a speech now carried the spirit of a movement, alive and untamed. The chants of the youth rolled like waves against the walls, unstoppable, echoing through every corner. Ibrahim Traoré did not need to raise his hand to command silence. He simply stood and allowed the energy of the moment to breathe. His presence itself was enough to anchor the storm. But President Ruto could no longer hide his unease. He had ruled over many restless gatherings, faced protests, and silenced critics before. But this was different. This was not a protest organized by political opponents. It was not a rebellion funded by outside forces. It was something raw, born from the hearts of the youth themselves. And most dangerous of all, it had been sparked by a man who stood fearless in the middle of his capital. Ruto finally stepped forward, taking the microphone for himself. His voice was calm, yet beneath it trembled a weight of suppressed anger. "Kenya is a sovereign nation," he declared, his words carefully measured. "We welcome visitors, but we will not allow anyone to undermine our leadership or create divisions among our youth. This is our home, and only we will decide our path." Some in the audience clapped politely, but most remained silent, their faces expressionless. The words were familiar, the kind they had heard countless times from leaders who promised change yet delivered little. Compared to the fire of Traoré's speech, the president's words sounded hollow, stripped of conviction. Traoré did not respond immediately. He let the silence weigh down the hall, forcing every ear to listen, every heart to pound in expectation. Then, in a voice that carried both humility and defiance, he said, "Leadership is not a throne to be defended. It is a duty to be fulfilled. And when the young rise to remind us of our duty, it is not division, it is a call to return to the truth." The room erupted once more. This time, it was not only students who cheered. Even some older professors, journalists, and civil servants joined in, clapping and nodding. The wave of support was too strong to ignore, and the president's expression grew tighter. It was then that the real twist unfolded. The young girl who had spoken earlier returned, holding up a torn notebook. She shouted above the noise, "These are the promises written to us, promises that have never been kept." Her trembling hands waved the notebook high, and the crowd roared in agreement. She then threw it onto the stage, where it landed at Traoré's feet. The symbol was powerful, broken promises laid bare before a foreign leader who had dared to speak the truth. The whole shook with chants of unity, and the atmosphere grew more dangerous with every passing second. Security guards exchanged nervous glances, waiting for orders. For the first time, it was no longer clear who truly controlled the whole, the president who claimed authority, or the man whose words had ignited the people's hearts. And in that uncertainty, the future of the night, and perhaps of Kenya's youth, hung in the balance. The whole was a storm, its air heavy with chants, cries, and the pounding of restless feet. The young girl's torn notebook still lay on the stage, its scattered pages fluttering as if they carried the weight of every broken promise. Ibrahim Traoré bent slightly, picked it up, and held it high above his head. The crowd erupted into thunderous applause, their voices rising higher than before, their hope and anger now bound to that single symbol of betrayal. For a moment, it looked as though the roof itself might give way under the force of the people's voices. Yet amid the chaos, President Ruto remained still. His eyes did not leave Traoré, and his silence carried a message more chilling than words. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but heavy with authority. "You may fire up their hearts," he said slowly, "but you will not take their loyalty from their land." Traoré lowered the notebook, his face solemn. He stepped closer to the microphone, his words deliberate, cutting through the uproar like a blade through cloth. "Loyalty is not stolen," he replied. "It is earned. And when leaders abandon their promises, the youth do not abandon their country, they reclaim it." His voice echoed across the hall, and once again the crowd roared, unstoppable, unafraid. The guards finally moved in, their boots striking the floor in unison as they approached the podium. Fear rippled through some of the audience, but many shouted in protest, raising their arms, demanding that Traoré be allowed to continue. A few students even pushed forward, standing between the podium and the advancing guards. The tension rose to a breaking point. Then, something no one expected happened. Traoré raised his hand, not in defiance, but in calm. The whole fell quiet, waiting for his next words. He did not shout, he did not fight, he only spoke with a steady conviction that felt stronger than any weapon. "If you silence me tonight," he said, "remember that you cannot silence the truth. For every voice you stop, 1,000 more will rise. This is not about me. It is about them, and they are not going anywhere." The words struck like lightning. The students began chanting again, this time not his name, but a single word: "Freedom, freedom, freedom." Their voices shook the hall with such force that the guard hesitated, unsure whether to advance or retreat. The line between control and chaos had blurred, and no order seemed strong enough to contain it. President Ruto stood motionless, his ministers urging him to leave, but he did not move. He knew that whatever step he took now would define his legacy. To silence the voice would mean risking a fire that could spread beyond the walls of the hall. To allow it would mean conceding ground in his own house of power. The chants continued, louder, unstoppable. Traoré's eyes swept across the sea of young faces, each one shining with courage and defiance. He knew the speech was no longer his. It had become theirs. And in that moment, as the whole shook with the cries of freedom, the world outside waited, wondering if Kenya had just witnessed the birth of something far greater than a speech, perhaps the birth of a revolution.